Pandariyen Kutri and Badanai Iniyarindien Pentagayal Peramarkatris. He says, I never know what is death, and now I look at this woman, I look at her eyes, and I know how death looks like. The second thing I think about art is, I mean, the people who inspired me to become a writer, people who inspired me. Obviously, one example is Arundhati Roy. We all believe in this. It was said by a very prominent right-wing politician who said, Sabka number aayega.
An activist, a translator, and a poet as well. And you do all these work in all these genres with equal ease. What excites you the most?
Thank you, ma'am, for having me here. Thanks to everyone who's organized KeralaLegislature and the KeralaLegislature Book Festival for inviting me first. I think it's a very interesting question on working across all these different forms and formats. I personally like the novel a lot because it lets you spend a lot of time with it, like 2 years, 3 years. It's like building a home, right? Like you fill every corner. And so I love the involvement of it. But then I think everything makes you happy in a different way, like I think poetry makes you happy because, you get the instant connect. So I like everything that I do, but I think possibly my favorite would be the form of the novel.
Well, I thought, today we are going to discuss the extent of freedom that is allowed to a writer. And the word allowed to a writer itself is quite tricky because a democratic government actually ensures freedom of speech. And writers also are very paradoxical creatures, you could say, because they use the freedom of expression in order to uphold the vision of a new tomorrow, which might be very different from the status quo that is experienced at present. So when we travel down that road, especially in India now, how far do you think we can travel calling the road freedom? What are the obstacles and the barriers? Because you said once in one of your interviews that India is a prison house of several nationalisms.
Thank you. So I think that's like 2 or 3 questions that I'll answer each of them. So the first question is, what do you think of the freedom of speech at this point? And I think that in terms of how do you access this right, how do you relate to it as a writer, there have been extremes. There's an entire spectrum in which you can look at freedom play out. So with people like Gauri Lankesh or Kalburgi, they just get assassinated for speaking the truth. And then there are people who like, Anand Teltunde, Varavara Rao, slightly radical, like powerful writers who get imprisoned or, like have fake cases put on them. And then you have, I think somewhere along the spectrum, you have people who are in some way or the other bullied, like a lot of newspaper and a lot of journalists have cases. They're not necessarily in jail, but they still have to go through this process of intimidation, raids, like what happened, I think, with the news channel, like 40 young journalists had their phones seized, they had their laptops seized. And at the end of the spectrum, and this is really important, is that when they start doing it to everyone, some are killed, some are in prison, some are having cases against them, then people people self-censor themselves. They don't talk what they have to talk. They don't say what they have to say. And I think that is really dangerous because you don't know how big that is. Like, self-censorship is so immense that many writers, know that they have so much to say, but they're like, this is not the time to say that, and this is not the best place to say that. And also, none of this is about a single individual writer. I really think we have to look at it as a structural issue because even if you're very bold, even if you have very powerful things to say, is the media going to publish that? Is a newspaper going to carry that? Is a TV channel going to show that clip? And I think this is where the real problem comes. In some ways, it's subverted by social media, but in some ways, social media is also corporate owned, so you just don't break the barriers. So I do believe that it's really a very difficult space at this time, and I think it's going to get worse. So actually, we should be in some sense happy that, we're able to have all these conversations at this point in time.
Yeah, that is where my next question takes me, because you spoke about social media, and when technology was brought in with fanfare, social media platforms were available, they were sort of heralded as the freeway of freedom, the new highway of freedom rather. But you recently heard, when Musk was being interviewed for his biography, he said, I bought Twitter because my daughter was getting radicalized by it. So, I mean, she was coming out as, a trans person, and she was heavily influenced by communist ideology. I don't want Twitter doing that anymore, and that's why I bought Twitter, is what he said. So that makes us suspicious about the type of information that you get on these platforms. How mediated are they?
So I think that with Elon Musk, it depends on which side of the bed he gets out of that day. So, he has a lot of reasons for what he says about why he bought Twitter. Sometimes it's because it was an ego issue, sometimes it's because of his daughter, sometimes because, somebody had a wager on Twitter. He wants to fight Mark Zuckerberg physically. So, this is not a very stable individual. So I would take everything he says with a pinch of salt. But then coming to this issue of social media, there are, there's obviously with elections, for instance, coming up next year, you have to really watch these platforms carefully, like how does advertising work, who gets to see what ads, what news is flagged off, is there fact-checking going on, is there a right-wing bias, because I think in the US as well as in Indian examples, we know that there was a huge right-wing bias, which does propel, right-wing forces to come to power. But also at the same time, you look at what's happening in Gaza. You look at what's happening in Palestine, all the bombings, all of the, the actual fact that there is a genocide. We see it play out in real time, and it's happening because of social media, like because individual users have Twitter. Individual users are posting these photos of the bombings, photos of the rubble, photos of doctors. Doctors are saying what's happening in the hospitals. Because otherwise, if you go by mainstream media is just going to parrot the lines of the imperialist superpowers. They're going to just say, oh, Hamas is hiding, or Hamas is using these underground tunnels, or they're going to say whatever suits them, this larger narrative of Islamophobia, and this narrative in which, somehow imperialist supremacy comes out first. So I really believe that in some ways, I still continue to believe social media is empowering, which is also why you see when Israel was doing all of these attacks 2 or 3 days ago, they literally did a communications blackout. They took out all the cell phone towers, all the communications towers, because they want to do this genocide with no information. And I think that's how every genocide is carried out, And we see, and it's not just Palestine, right? We saw that in Tamilam, War Without Witnesses in 2009, but you also see that in parts of India. You see that, there's an internet shutdown in Kashmir, there's internet shutdown in Manipur. So, and India is actually one of the top countries doing this internet shutdown. So the question happens of, why is a democracy shutting down the internet? So I think we keep coming back to how free are we, I guess.
But I guess you came out very fiercely in your support of Arundhati Roy. You did not just hesitate to come out in support of her. You did not care about the legal issues or being imprisoned. I think you wrote a very powerful article about that.
Thank you. So I think when I actually submitted this article, I wrote to the Guardian, and actually I think it was somehow, there's always people from Kerala everywhere. I think it was my editor was somebody from Kerala. I will not give his first name. Second name was Mr. Koshi. So he wrote to me and he said, are you sure you want to publish this? What if there's a backlash? What if, as you say, like if they're going after her, they will literally go after any of us and any of you. And I said, well, I'd rather go down burning than, like just wait. Because at this time, we all believe in this. It was said by a very prominent right-wing politician who said, sabka number aayega.
Right.
Yeah, so we know at some point our number is going to come. So the question is, are you going to speak up and say all the things you want to say and then face what comes to you? You're going to be quiet. Being quiet is not going to help you because they're going to find a way to fix you in something or the other. So the question is, at least you feel at peace with yourself. You feel at peace that, you spoke about this. So yeah, I felt happy to write this part, even though it was very sad for me because it marks a certain rupture, right? So Arundhati Roy is literally the most famous Indian author today, like not just India, internationally. Like everyone knows her. She's been translated into so many languages. And in some ways, over the last 20 years, she has served as the conscience of this country, right? Like whether it's the nuclear test, whatever it is that she's talking, whether it's the citizenship rights, whether it's mining, whether it's, Operation Green Hunt, whether even if it's Kashmir, she's always been at the forefront of talking her opinion. And then you realize that if they go after her for all the international publicity, then it means that it's open season, like they're going to go after everyone and anyone.
That sort of defeats the purpose of democracy, doesn't it? Democracy believes in dissenting voices.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that whatever they are imagining themselves to be, they like to call themselves was that mother of democracy, right? And sometimes mothers don't want children to talk. I think they were like, just shut up. I'm a mother sometimes. I'm like, I don't want to hear any of you saying anything. Just shut and give me this peace. So yeah, perhaps their idea of democracy is, making everyone compliant children, like, infantilizing everyone and saying, don't say anything. Your mother is going to take care of you. Your mother is going to provide for you. Your mother knows best what's good for you. And a mother is a loving figure, but also...
How icon becomes a very maternal figure.
Yeah, so it's possible. I don't know what it is, but obviously this doesn't coexist. And I believe that, yeah, there is this full-fledged attack on the freedom of speech.
Coming to your poetry and your writing, you've always taken up the issues of gender and caste. Do you see your art as a vehicle to sort of transmit your ideology, the strong ideologies that you believe in? Is your art a vehicle for speaking about your ideology?
So, no, I still believe that, nothing can displace or replace actual political work. Like, even, for instance, we talk about Hindutva, we talk about whatever is happening today in the country, this crackdowns, this right-wing turn, this majoritarianism. But, the fact is, few writers cannot change it. Like, I'd be the first to say that, just writing cannot change it. Writing can change ideology, but a lot of this is about power. A lot of this is about who gets to win, who gets to displace those who are already in power, how do you change the system, how do you capture power, and also how do you take these ideas to the people, and how do you do actual political work. But beyond that, I also believe that art has a very powerful role at the heartbeat of these things, because art allows you to, like, even if you are putting forth an ideology, it allows you to be critical. It allows you this little space to be completely independent, Like, you don't become a political ragdoll, you don't accept compromises, you can be like full of your jagged edges. So I believe that, art is in that sense very powerful. The second thing I think about art is, the people who inspired me to become a writer, people who inspired me, obviously one example is Arundhati Roy. Like, in 97 she wins the Booker Prize, and she doesn't become a commodity. She could have easily just become a best-selling author, writing best-selling books. But instead, she becomes this rebel figure. She becomes a figure, she becomes a person who questions everything. And she becomes this writer as, a moral voice of society. So, and the second person, I think, whose writing or whose general ideology inspired me a lot was this Latin American writer called Toni Cade Bambara, who said something like, what is the role of the radical artist? And she says, the role of the radical artist is to make the revolution irresistible. Like, that's what you do. Like, if you're creating art, you have to take more and more people towards this concept of, social change, towards this concept of revolution, and that's your job. So, and I think that I sort of imbibed that vision into what I was doing.
Yeah, so that becomes a little complex when I look at it, because as an artist, do you feel that it has confined you? You feel this responsibility, the moral responsibility to speak for the marginalized, to speak for the silenced. So in that way, has it become a constraint, or do you find it freedom?
No, I don't find that a constraint at all. I think it's very liberating, because you see, the thing is, you're not a spokesperson for anyone. You're a spokesperson. You literally are speaking from what you realize or what you see. So you're not. I don't think I'm a spokesperson. But what I think is interesting is that, for instance, one of the big issues we have in this country today is this, like, let's say, when it comes to religion, they talk about love jihad. Or when it comes to caste, they have all these honor killings going on when people marry across caste. But is it an issue only of, let's say, Muslim people? Is it only an issue of the low caste people? Is it only an issue of the Dalit people? Or is it a broader issue of, let's say, women who have the right to choose their partners? Or is it a broader issue of all of society that people should be with who they love? And once you bring this down to, looking at it from a broader perspective, it's a question of love. And, it's such a basic human need, it's a basic human feeling. And then you're not basically constraining yourself to anything. Like, it's a very political question. And it's a question that literally involves all of us, whether it involves us today or tomorrow or day after, it's, relative. So I don't think that talking about any issue actually constrains you.
And Indian patriarchy is not going to go away anytime soon, do you think?
No, I don't want to be a doomsday person. I don't believe in this idea of this pessimism that things are going to stay the same, because you see change happening every day. Like, you see change happening overnight, and one of the things is people are always amenable to change. I strongly believe, like, we always complain, right? That they have brainwashed everybody through WhatsApp universities. The rot is very high, the poison is very high. But obviously, if somebody can be brainwashed that way, I believe that if you do the right work, you can, de-brainwash them, or, re-brainwash them, or whatever, or make them think for themselves. So I just believe that as long as we have these capabilities to think and to reason, it's possible to believe in change. And also, I don't think this idea of this Indian patriarchy is a monolith. Like, not every Indian man gets to be a patriarch in the same way. Like, yeah, so obviously there's so many fractures in this. And patriarchy in India also cannot exist on its own. It exists because of the caste system.
Exactly.
It exists because of the way,
the two dominator systems sort of supplement each other.
Exactly, and it also exists in so many ways because of, entrenched class biases. So if you look at it in all of this, then you realize that the struggle against patriarchy or the struggle for feminism is literally everyone's struggle. So
men are also involved in this.
Yeah, struggle. Exactly. I think men are really, like, at the receiving end of it as well. Like, obviously on the one hand they're at the oppressing end, but they're also like, if your girlfriend doesn't turn up for a date, then you're like, what's wrong with this system, man? Like, her father's policing her brother's policing her, but this is also ruining your life, right? So I believe that.
I don't think feminism exists in the body. It is an attitude of the mind. It's a.
Oh, well, I don't know what to answer to this question.
It's got nothing to do with the physical body, whether you're male or female or trans.
Yes, I think everybody can be a feminist. I definitely believe that, men can be feminist. But I say this with the disclaimer that sometimes, not always, sometimes, men who speak the language of feminism can be worse patriarchs than men who actually speak the language of patriarchy. So it's it's a very essential disclaimer. But really, I find this often, and especially in very progressive circles, you hear people like, he said all the right things and then he did this. And that's like, that's literally the Satan quoting the Bible or something, right? So.
Well, that sort of takes us to the next question. A book that you wrote, you called it autofiction, actually, When I Hit You. And you spoke about the turbulent experiences in marriage. In many interviews, you've spoken of it as very autobiographical. What was the reason that you decided to call it autofiction? Because the narrative too is not a very simple linear narrative, is it? The narratorial voice also is quite complex. So why autofiction? Why not autobiography?
I wanted to actually, this is a question that eats me up. Like, I can have an entire session just on this. But
go ahead.
No, it doesn't require that much time. So I remember a long time ago, I think when I was a kid, I was reading Kamala Das and My Story, and she called it an autobiography. And you know what happened in our society, right? Women writes about life, love, sex. And then they were like, everyone was up in arms against it. And she had to say, well, some parts of it are imaginary, some parts of it are fiction. It's not all real, some of it is made up. So, this is the kind of society we exist in, that, you write something and then you say it's autobiography. They're going to be like, is this true? What's the truth value? So people are going to go after the truth value. And then you say, okay, but, for me, this is not about the truth value per se, because all of this is true, but it's about the fact that I'm telling a story. And for me, the more important aspect is, how do you narrate this? How do you... and for me, this is... Really, I went to this question as an artist, then as a victim. because I think it's very easy to just feel bad for yourself, like, and it's not easy to come out of it. But when you look at it as an artist, you're like literally looking at it as material, and you're like, how do you take this material and make it say something very strong? And you don't want to feel bad for yourself. You just want to, like, okay, highlight something, just be absolutely dispassionate about it. So for me, the act of writing it was really, how do you, and also one of those things I really feel about violence, and not just about violence in books, but violence on film, is that whenever, let's say, you have the man hit a woman, you see in audiences in theaters, they're basically cheering that. Like the hero insults the woman, the audience is cheering that. So you have a way in which you have to write about violence, but you have to make sure that men are not getting off on it. Like nobody is getting off on it. Nobody actually feels better when they read, let's say, the women, getting abused or beaten up, and then they feel like, much better about themselves. So you have to, in some way, write this narrative that doesn't become a voyeurism, right? A voyeurism of women suffering. It doesn't become trauma porn. So, for me, it was really like, my interest in this was, how do you tell the story? So for me, it was much more about fiction, also because it is a story that applies to so many women. Like, I spent 4 months in a bad marriage, which is, in terms of a lifetime, very less. But there are people who spend their entire lives trapped in it. So how do you write all their truths? And as much as it's a very individual experience, it is a very universal suffering, right? So for me, it was like, I couldn't just call it memoir, like, also, how do you look at a woman's life? Like, I want to look at my life as all the work I've done, all the fun I've had, all the loves I've had. I don't want to reduce it to the fact that I was a victim, Like, my life is something else. My life is not just this suffering, right? So why would I say this is the story of my life? My life is something larger than that. And I was also only in my 20s at that point. So you don't want to reduce your entire life's work to what happened to you for a brief period in your 20s, right? You want to be liberated. You don't want that to be the frame or the prism through which people see you. I mean, I would like to be known for saying, controversial, provocative shit like India is a prison house of nationalities, than to the fact that, I got assaulted or beaten up in a marriage. So I think it's a question of what did you choose to be and how you choose to be seen.
The personal is the political, as far as a woman is concerned.
Yeah, that too.
And as you have made it very clear, I don't think, what I got was that a man wouldn't have these problems where he writing about a bad marriage. He wouldn't be judged.
Well, I honestly don't know how to answer this question because I personally believe that nobody should be judged for writing what happened to them, what didn't happen to them. Because in some ways, writing displays what's happening in society. But also, this is a very complex question because a lot of novels are about men facing middle-aged crises, shagging their students, right? Like, white men. So white man doesn't know what to do. He's in a university or he's in a whatever random job. He's losing his marriage. He's facing a midlife crisis. Pretty young thing comes along. So I don't know. This is the entire body of work that for a long time white men were producing. So are they judged for it, or is it called a work of genius? I don't know.
Most of them are classics, I would say.
They're classics. So just leave it there. Yeah.
And then moving on to your work as a translator. Again, the question of freedom comes up there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How much freedom do you get as a translator? And this is in regard with a translation that you have done of Tirukkural, where you have very clearly given it a feminist slant. My question is, would this be possible if you were translating a living author? Because Roland Barthes can declare that the author is dead and all that. But when it comes to translation rights and publishing and all that, the writer is very much present.
Yes and no. So the thing is, with the living author, I always, the writers who have translated have always had this slightly dominatrix behavior. So I'm like, please listen to me. I know what's best for you. So I'm like, please don't make a fool of yourself. Don't write this patriarchal shit. Don't think that the male is the universal. I'm going to remove this paragraph because it's very, 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 it's going to make you look like a patriarch, or it's going to make you look stupid, or it's going to make you, like, I think you take that editorial decision because you want to protect somebody, right?
So you are, as a translator, do you sort of alter the text? This is just
Is
out
it
of
is it
academic
is it an
interest.
No, it's not an alteration. I'm basically updating it. It's like, you have an Android phone, and then you need it. You need to update. You need to install this update so that it functions better. You're fixing some bugs. You're fixing some security issues. So I think this is exactly what you do, right? Like when you're a translator and the text is like, and the author is alive, you're going to say, well, this is not going to work. This is just for you. Maybe you were living in a cave before. Now you're going to come and you're going to embrace what's happening in society. So we take out all these negative stuff. They're going to agree. A lot of writers, whether it's men or women, agree to that. They agree to changes. So I think, for instance, with Varavara Rao, and I've never translated Telugu poetry before, and so I was putting together his collection. Now, man is 84 years old, and then there's this poem on women, and I was like, wow, you're talking about liberation all this time, but your conception of women is about women as mothers or women as this or that. And I'm like, I'm going to change this poem a little bit. Well, my little bit was a lot, but still I was like, I'm not going to put my name as the editor on a book that has these backward ideas, So I went and I retranslated that poem. So I think when they're alive, you get to bully them. When they're not alive, then you have to really work hard. And you have to work harder because obviously this person is dead and gone, the text is a fixed text. And with Tirukkural, it's like for 2000 years, you've not had female translators. So, and that shows the extent of bias in our society, because once the text is a classic, once the text is like at the lifeblood of your civilization, once the text is so important, they somehow think that only men are empowered enough, powerful enough, connected enough, intellectual enough, central enough, grave enough, deep enough to go and do these translations. They don't think that women can do that, right? Like, this is so big that you can't touch it, right? Like, you're like this little girl with candy. You can write about marriage. You can write about clothes. You can write about fashion. If you want, you can write about sex. But no, all this big thought, these big ideas, they are for us. And you have to go there and you have to dismantle that. You have to literally say, no, I'm going to take up space. I'm going to do this translation. So in 2000 years, you've all done these horrible jobs, like hit jobs on the Tirukkural, and I'm going to take the love poetry and I'm going to tell you how it's done. And it's not because like I think I'm important. I think the book is important, and who is the person in the book. So all of this Kural is written about a Tamil woman in the book, right? Yeah. So if Valluvar was writing in Tamil, the character, the center of all this Kural, all this love poetry is a Tamil woman. Like, you were writing about her and not giving her space. Now I am a Tamil woman. I am going to let her take that space. Like for 2000 years, and it's not a joke, because from the 17th century, from the 18th century, we had these translations, and part of the translations were done by European missionaries, and part of the translation were done by all these Hindu revivalists. So when when Valluvar is talking about kamam or sex, the translation basically says union. It says congress.
It
says intercourse. So they So it's very sanitized, and even the basic articulation of the word sex just goes missing, and female desire goes missing. Okay, on the one hand, there's all of this erasure. On the other hand, they also start foisting frameworks on it. So when you look at the Kural, at least the love poetry, like there's 250 Kurals there, and suddenly they have said, oh, this is the love between the husband and the wife. But this man doesn't mention the husband or the wife. There is a man, there is a woman, and many of these Kurals are like just addressed to the lover. It could be a man, it could be a woman. And then you're like, why did you bring the framework of marriage into it? And even if, like, I believe in one of the 250, there's a reference to a husband. But even if it was a husband, as in you don't know what marriage looked like 2000 years ago. You don't know whether it was elastic, whether it was plastic, whether it was polygamous, whether it was monogamous, whether it was temporary.
What the equation was between
them. What was the equation? What was the thing? So it was the text is democratic, and then you ruined it a lot. So you put all these structures, and then the worst thing is after these two, this imposition of frameworks, this erasure of the feminine voice. I think the third more difficult thing for me was to come to terms with the fact that a lot of these translators had their own ideology, which was a very patriarchal ideology. So what they did is that they would introduce the concept of chastity. But the Tamil doesn't talk about the concept of chastity. There was no, at least in the love poems, there's no concept of chastity. So where do you come from? Where do you invent this word? So the Tamil closest equivalent is about a word like niraimai, which is like a woman who is fulfilled. That doesn't mean a woman who is chaste. It doesn't go into this terrain at all. But then, right, beginning from, let's say, the 12th century, there are all these efforts in which the scholars come and give commentary on the Tirukkural, and then they put these ideas. So what is a text becomes completely fundamentally altered in its reception. And then you're like, no, I'm going to have to take this out. So obviously, as a translator, I think it's a very political work. But also the question is, it's not about, it's a freedom because you're doing it all in the public domain, right? Like, no, like if people have to question you, they have to question you publicly, but all these words are there, all these books are there. And it's like, obviously, like on the one hand, uncles will be simping publicly, but privately, I'm sure they're very agonized, like, what is she doing? Like, what's she doing to the idea of the Tamil woman? Because the idea of the Tamil woman in their mind is somebody who is to be very quiet, very demure, very soft. And chaste. And then, but the Tamil woman, the Tirukkural, was a very intimidating person, right? Like, so, like, right in, I think the third Kural goes, Pandariyen Kutri என்பதனை இனி அறிந்தேன் பெந்தகையால் பேரமர் கற்று. He says, I never know what is death, and now I look at this woman, I look at her eyes, and I know how death looks like. So basically, men are being, intimidated, they are being almost dazzled and terrorized by whatever the Tamil women represents. So this is the Tamil woman that existed, not whatever you have in your fantasy. So yeah, I think it's Meena versus Tamil uncles at this point. It is okay.
And I hope Meena wins.
Let's hope, yeah.
And another book that you translated, you spoke about the untranslatability of certain, I think Salma's story, where you spoke about the idea that some words can't be translated because there are no cultural equivalents. And another question is when the marginalized people write sometimes, they use their own dialects. When they write in their mother tongue, the use of dialects is very predominant. That itself becoming a resistance. We're not using the so-called standardized elite sort of, the understood elite narrative, but we are trying to articulate it in our own voice. But how far does a dialect yield to translation? Particularly because you have mentioned the untranslatability of certain words.
I think untranslatability is a very interesting topic. I don't think it should weigh us down. I don't think that that should prevent us from translating. But at the same time, we realize that not everything is understood the same. So with Salma, obviously, it's this question of, couple of... I mean, I speak Tamil, but I was very stumped with a lot of very particular words that belonged only to... It was one, a regional issue because it was only in the south of Tamil Nadu, but also it was a religion issue because Muslims or the community that she's writing about in that particular village have a certain way of referring even to their mothers and fathers, which is not the same as, what the normal, not the normal, what I mean, the others would do, what the others would do. So for me, it was like I had to go and, find out what it is. And then when you put it in English, you don't want to go back to othering them, right? You don't want to... you don't want to use something that makes it specific. You don't want to use something that makes them, let's say, imitate the others. So it was a question of how do you translate all of this? So do you retain the words? Do you change? And do you make it distinct? Do you still want to keep the flavor of it? So these were questions that I faced a lot with Salma's work. And I think she's an incredible writer. But what was the other question? I forgot.
The question was the dialects, the
translation
of dialects.
So it's not just the question of dialects. So dialects are, obviously tied to places and, people. But I remember the first time I translated the book, I was 18. And I had to make a lot of use of the dictionary, right? So just to know that I'm really, really sure that I got the meaning right. And I was working on the translation of this Dalit leader, Thirumavalavan, who runs the Liberation Panthers, who founded the Liberation Panthers, is the president now. And what I realized about a lot of the words that he was using in his speeches, it was not even in the dictionary. So these are speeches that is made to tens of thousands of people, but the mainstream dictionary is so caste-coded. It codes into a certain type of Tamil that doesn't even know or doesn't even acknowledge the existence of other Tamils. And so I remember, I still have the copy of my own dictionary because wherever these words were missing, I would write them down. Like this word exists for millions of people, but why doesn't it exist in your dictionary? So I believe that, at this level, you don't even have to translate. Like at some point, even the lexicon has all these, boundaries, has all these gatekeeping, and then you have to allow language to expand
And this becomes interesting because you are an authority to speak on this with your PhD in sociolinguistics. So your translations, has that led to the formation of any sort of framework when you consider these cultural differences in translations and all that? Have you been able to develop a sort of framework for translation based on your own experience?
No, I have not. No, I have not exactly theorized a lot. But with the Tirukural, for instance, like recently, I wanted to write what it is to talk about decolonial way of translating. So, and this was important for me because see now once we have language, the problem is we don't control who uses language, right? So right now, decolonialism, which is, let's say people are talking about settler colonialism, they're talking about, what Israel is doing in Gaza, Israel is doing in Palestine, and they're like, if you're talking about decolonization, talk about these people who are colonized, whose land was taken away. But right now, the word decolonial in India is used far more by the right wing than by the left wing. Far more by the right wing than by the liberals. So when they talk about decolonization, they're like, oh, we have to get out of the decolonial mindset, which means we have to go back to Sanatana Dharma.
Yeah, the pre-lapsarian innocence sort of thing.
Yeah, so it's this whole return to, and not all return to indigeneity is a great thing. Just because we are decolonial doesn't mean we want to do child marriages, right? Just because we are decolonial doesn't mean that everything, we don't want to be burning women or brides on their husbands' dead bodies or go back to sati because it's decolonial. So the whole idea of this decolonial discourse, decolonializing the Indian mind, they actually use this even when they introduce the national education policy. And I think we have to be very, very careful of what is this decolonialism, because obviously we have to articulate decolonialism, but we have to be aware of the dangers of the right wing using it. And for me, I'm like, why is it that colonial means in our imagination white people? Because for a Tamil person who is resisting Hindi imposition, colonial is, for me, the colonialism of Tamil started with Sanskrit. The colonialism of Tamil started in, let's say, in the 60s with the imposition of Hindi. So when we are resisting Hindi, we are opposing a certain colonialism. And I don't think colonialism here has anything to do with skin color. It's about whose power. If it's the power of Delhi that's being imposed on Tamil Nadu, then this is what you're opposing, right? So how do you define these internal colonialisms? Just because somebody is, has the same skin color as you, doesn't mean they get to do what they want to do. They can't impose their power that way. So for me, this framework, I think a very decolonial feminist framework, was kind of important, not only to retrieve this text, but also to think through language, to think through what it means to have identity, and to think through and also claim the space for women within language. Often language politics or state rights, federalism, all of these questions become men's issues, right? And we are always talking only about people, women's issues, marriages, violence, sexual violence, maybe desire. So we just get into these little brackets, and I'm like, no, if you're a woman, it means you take up space, you talk about everything. And so for me, it's the same with language. And I think language is so vital. We are using it everywhere. So if you're a feminist, you claim your language.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Women's language, which many feminists thought and wrote about. You sort of said, to talk about anything that you would wish to talk about. That reminded me of what Adichie recently said. She said, there is a sort of self-censorship that goes on within me now. I have cordoned off a lot of ideas that are within me that I want to talk about for fear of wokeism and of the cancel culture that even cancelled Germaine Greer. And this is something that Adichie spoke about. Do you worry about the self sort of control and the self-censorship that Adichie is worried about?
See, I think I would, as much as I like Adichie as a fiction writer, I have to distance myself from her opinion on trans people. And because, you could say something that sounds intelligent, that can sound controversial, but you could be putting, especially as a global celebrity, a lot of trans people's lives and safety and public perception at risk. So I think with power, with exposure, with celebrity, you have extreme amounts of responsibility. You just can't go and give a comment, right? So I think in that sense, Adichie, as someone who, you know, a lot of us writers of color rallied behind, I think it was kind of disappointing. Because I also think, and this is something I wrote on Twitter when the first comments from Adichie came, I think it's this idea of who is a woman. I don't think it's so given even for, let's say, quote unquote, cis women, right? Like we become women. Like in some sense, I'm like, when I was younger, I always had this doubt, like, am I a woman enough? Like, I was really thinking, like, inside my heart, like, am I a woman or am I actually masquerading as a girl? Or masquerading as a woman? Because I'm like, I'm so ruthless. Like at some points, I'm like so ruthless. I'm like so clear in my thought. I'm like, maybe this is not how women are. And that you think that because that's what society tells you. Society tells you that women are weak. So when you think you're a strong person, you doubt if you're a woman. So this question of who is a woman is something that society has used to gaslight us. And like, you're not a good woman. You're not a woman. Like, this is not how women speak. So even if you're, let's say, born into this, let's say, gender, then you're like, you know, having all this gaslighting going on. Who is a good woman? Is this a woman? How women are you? So even for you to claim this space and say you're a woman, like even if you're cisgendered, is a struggle. Imagine the right, you know, struggle for trans women to take this space. And I think, you know, a woman is a woman, you know. So it's as that simple as that. Cis or trans, you don't have to go deeper into this and, you know, gatekeep womanhood, because then there's all kinds of gatekeeping, right? Are women who are childless, are they women enough? Are women who decide to be child-free, are they women enough? Do you have to be a mother to be a woman? Do you have to be menstruating to be a woman? Like, you know, I don't know at what point you draw the line on this. So having said that, and, you know, definitely distancing myself from the comments that, you know, or that she made and the kind of hurt that it caused, there are two aspects to, let's say, what goes for woke. So I think one of the things is, obviously, people are inflicting a lot of hurt, prejudice when they speak. So, and it's so coded. I mean, like, I worked in a university. You see there's this entire way, like somebody had shared something about caste is segregation by IQ. So you see all these very insidious ways in which caste superiority gets coded into language, somehow thinking that, you know, let's say the Brahmins are the intellectuals of our society. So all of this, there's so much of oppression in our society that you have to actually police people. You have to tone police people. You have to say, oh no, what makes you think like this? What makes you say like this? What gives you the right to say this? So I think you have to cross-question people, because it's not a small thing, right? You just can't let it slip. We're no longer in a place where we can let a comment, a small casteist comment, a small comment about superiority. Somebody says, oh, are you vegetarian? Or are you also a Thambram? Like, I often get asked this. You can't let that slip. You have to call it out. So on the one hand, I'm really powerful. And I think that this calling out, for me at least, is not just related to language alone. It's also like Me Too, for instance. Like, people of my generation, like, shit happened or shit was going to happen. And then you're like, you have to choose, right? You have to choose whether you want to do your art, or you have to choose if you're going to speak about it, spend your time on it, get exposed for it, get a bad name for it, and lose both your time and your credibility and get isolated. So we had these questions. Young people today are very daring. They are not thinking about this balancing act. They're going all out. They're putting themselves on the line. And then this is what they're doing with language. This is what they're doing with Me Too. This is what they're doing with oppression. So you have to be so inspired by them. However, what I think is happening is that in the absence of proper organization, in the absence of proper struggles, in the absence of enough grassroots work, the same people whom you call out, they know how to talk back. And this language, this polite language, so what they do is they say, oh, I'm learning. Oh, I'm unlearning. It means fuck all. Like, you know, when somebody says they're learning or unlearning, it means nothing. They're like, oh, I feel you. Like, whatever it is that they say, like, you know, I'm learning to develop my empathy, or I'm trying to say what's happening here. I wish there was more nuance. So all of this they say is just lip service. Because nobody wants to do real change, and they want to say the exact, and I think corporations are doing this much better than people are, right? So corporations have also learned how to use this language of empowerment, this language of individuality, this language of pink washing, this language of political correctness, this language of, let's say, Um, you know, the way they say is the right to work, for instance, is people are anti-union, right? So, so you have this very insidious ways in which language is being exploited, and this is something that young people who are woke have to be aware of. They're like, no, I don't want you to just say these things. I don't want you to just parrot these lines, but show this in action. And show this in action not just through these 2% CSR funds, which you're using to whitewash yourself, but in other ways. So I think that the problem for me is that wokeism ends with just policing language or policing what people say or statements, doesn't go into the grassroots and to actual protests. And I wish that we did more of that, or they did more of that. I mean,
you spoke about young people being lucky, but I just have a question for you as a writer. What I have noticed is that the youth today prefer to read concise writing, and they're very visual in that sense. So as a writer, how do you deal with this? Because you sort of hear about classics being rewritten in simple language, classics being condensed, and people sort of having a 5-minute attention span, which they'd rather spend on making an Instagram reel. So as a writer, how do you relate to this generation?
Yeah, so the thing is, see, all literature evolves, right? Like when people were reading magazines, and Charles Dickens was writing his novel as an episodic novel. So, yeah, and we're not writing episodic novels anymore, right? Unless somebody is doing that on Substack. But coming to this question, it's like, okay, so nobody is reading books. And then what do? Like, you can go sit in a corner and cry, nobody's reading books. Or you can actually say, okay, if I have something interesting to say, I should learn how to say that in 280 characters. I mean, this is before Elon Musk made Twitter long enough to write paragraphs. But, I mean, like, if you have to fight fascism, you should be able to fight it on WhatsApp forwards, you should be able to fight it on Instagram, you should be able to use Twitter for that. So, I mean, like, it's a question of aligning your literary interest and your literary talent or literary whatever hard work it is and your credentials to match the formula. Like, you have to go where the people are. You cannot say to somebody, okay, I'm going to write, because ma'am, like, you look at the life cycle, a book takes 5 years. Like, even if you're really like, one of the top authors, it takes anywhere between 3 years, right? Like, you publish it, you submit it. Okay, I submit my book now, let's say 1st of November, somebody's going to come back with edits in April, and it's going to be announced next January. Like, you cannot wait for this 3-year book cycle to make social change. Like, social change happens now. Like, you have to be there at the moment. So you cannot expect this life cycle of a book to create change. Maybe change used to happen back in those days without the internet or anything, with just ideas, taking their own time. But we are not Karl Marx, like, we put this manifesto there, and it's going to change mindsets. Like, we have to act now, like, and it's very pressing. So you're like, okay, have you tweeted? If there's a trending hashtag, like, have you said something about it? Have you expressed yourself? And I think we have to go where the people are. It's not, I think it's really elitism to say, oh, nobody is reading, because people are consuming a lot of information. Like, but where are you? Like, are you there? Are you giving it to them in the formats in which they consume their information? And I think it's really like, yeah, go to the people.
It's an attention economy. You want their attention, definitely.
And you do what it takes.
Was really enlightening to hear you speak on this, because usually people talk about going back to writing and making people read, but I don't think that is possible anymore. You have to address the altered cognition also. And before we wind up, I know that you're going to support the protests against Palestine in Cochin tomorrow.
Yeah.
And when you look at the world today, the world seems to be a very polarized place, whether it is here or abroad. What do you think of the future of India? Your opinion, because you have written about it.
No, I don't know what is. I'm always a very hopeful person, I believe, and I think only good things will happen, in the sense that things might get worse before they get better. But I still believe that it's a country of 1.4 billion people. You just cannot get away doing fascism. Maybe for some time, at some point, the job situation, the women's situation, the education situation, the food situation, all of this, the simmering discontent will come to the fore. Like, how long can you just manage media? How long can you just manage headlines? No, I think the system will give, and I think change is very much possible. Like I want to be optimistic about this.
So shall
Thank
we
you.
open the
we'll
questions
Yeah, I'll
to the
take questions.
audience?
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether the title of the session was correct or what we discussed is correct, because you dwelt upon so many things, and whether you'll be able to submit that the title is matching with what you said all along.
See, the title is what do you call a placeholder, right? I have to give some title. So, I'm very sorry if it was disappointing to you, but yeah, the title is for you to, let's say, just come into this hall.
One more question. UGC Net, they fancy you too much, because a lot of questions are asked about your works.
In UGC Net, yeah?
Yeah, I keep on failing because I don't know all of your works. So this time I'm going to see that I know all your works. Yeah. And,
Thank you.
And you dealt on various issues, but one question I cannot, there are layers of issues that you have dealt today. One, if you read this book of Nedo Okara 4, she talks about child of violence. Similarly, Arundhati Roy also talks about children of violence, and Dorothy Lessing also. So all the people who are born today are born out of love or out of violence.
I think, no, I really think that we are products in some sense of, rupture, and products of, what's happening around us. Like, let's say I was born in the 80s, and the big issue in the 80s in Tamil Nadu was the Elam liberation struggle. And we literally watched what the IPKF did. We watched what was happening. We watched why people were taking up arms, especially women were taking up arms. So, in some ways, violence has conditioned us. And it's not only the violence, let's say, of, intimate partner violence or domestic violence, which we witness, or even the violence of parents. Because, in India, what is never acknowledged is that parents can be violent to their children. So it was not only this regular, soft, domestic violence that was around us, but also the larger systemic violence, state violence. So I do think that, it has conditioned us and also made us look at the world in a very specific way. That's my answer. And in terms of the UGC Net, I find it funny as well. So, and it also makes me very dated. So I go to these meetings and somebody's like, I read your poetry in college, and I'm like, you're making me feel really old at this point, I would like to think of myself as a young woman, but just then you realize that, okay, this is my last year of being in my 30s, so let me enjoy my youth, So...